Cloud Atlas was a breakthrough for you to a larger audience. Do you know what it was that sort of pushed the right buttons with that book?
No idea. If I knew what it was, I'd be pushing them again, I promise you. That's really a question for readers, more than a question for me. As ever, I just wrote the book I wanted to write, and that's what it looked like. It has an unusual structure. It's eye-catching, but it needs to be more than eye-catching to sell the kind of numbers it sold. I don't know. And in a way, I shouldn't think about it too much, because if I did, I might be tempted to try to repeat myself, and that is not good for a writer. So I both don't know, and in a way I don't wish to know too accurately what it was that made that book work the way it did work. I'm very grateful to it. It paid for my house, and I'm really happy about that. But it's important to try to put some space between each of the books so that you're not going over the same old ground. There are writers who have done that, and the books get a little more disappointing each time, and I don't want to be one of those writers. And I think one of the ways to avoid that fate is to be omnivorous in how I live and what I read, but also omnivorous in how I write. And if I want, if my books are my children, then I want them to have distinct personalities and not have any twins in the family. The mirror image, I just put a mirror at the end of Italo Calvino's novel If on a Winter's Night a Traveller, which is a sequence of interrupted narratives which are never recontinued. But I found it a bit frustrating, as I often do with postmodern narratives. They're more ingenious than they are loved, and I wanted the rest of the story. So I thought, what would a book look like if you interrupted the narrative 6 times and then didn't just leave it and have the end, but actually went back and recontinued them backwards. So I was just curious about whether that would work or not. But yes, I owe half the idea to Mr. Calvino, and if he were alive, I'd buy him a beer or a decent bottle of Italian wine, probably. I was younger. I might not do it these days, but when you're young, you don't yet have the technique, but you do have a certain, I'll have a go at that. You have a certain rashness or unguardedness, and I think that's why I didn't think about the dangers inherent. So I didn't think I was being a daredevil doing anything particularly dangerous. Looking back, I probably was, and had that book flopped, I might have found it very difficult to get another contract from another publisher, but luckily it sold 1.5 million and counting, and thank you. But I don't deserve the credit for having seen anything blindingly original and then went ahead and wrote it. I simply wanted to see what it would look like if someone did write it, and no one else was doing it, so I did it. But sometimes your youth and your inexperience can be an ally, and it was in that case for me.
Your latest book, your very new book, The Bone Clocks, also have a structure that starts out some way in the past and stretches into the future. Did that book also start out in your mind with a structure, or was it a character, Holly Sykes, who popped up first?
It started with the structure, but the structure changed because it wasn't working. So originally I was going to write 70 short stories, one for each of the years of Holly Sykes, the protagonist. But for various reasons it didn't work. So those 70 stories became 7 novellas, and then set one per decade of real time, but also one per decade of Holly's life. Then I needed to start him off as a teenager, because when you're 6 years old, literary possibilities are limited. So that got reduced to a structure. In a way, it looks a bit like Cloud Atlas, but I don't have the interrupted narratives, and it came from a very different place. Stories have a number of beginnings, and often, if a writer says, if a writer gives you a perfect, flawless creation myth for a novel, it's generally because it's an anecdote that's been polished and polished and polished and has had the rough edges knocked off. Actually, they evolve from several stem cells, not just one, I think. The biggest question I think about is, how can I make this damn book work? And anything larger than the rectangle of my iMac screen is not my business. It's not good for me to think where I sit in the pantheon. It's not good for me to Google myself. It's not good for me to think, am I inventing something new here? It's only good for me to think, what do I want to write? What excites me? And what gives you that literary adrenaline whoosh? And then once you've decided that, how can I make it work? So that's the biggest question I ever consider. You imply we all have imaginations. It's a human function. It allows us to experiment with our environment without having to pay the physical consequences of that. I think it's a Darwinian trick that we've evolved, but other animals have them as well, I believe. It's just the way it gets used. Of course, we all have faces, we all have retinas, but they're somewhat different. The way the imagination gets used and the parts of it that are used most relative to other aspects of the imagination. It's part of our mind, whatever the mind is. That's what differs from person to person. When? I mean, all kids invent things, all kids have invisible friends, all kids are scared by what's in the darkness. Suppose it's not that writers evolve it in a different direction. I think writers don't properly grow up. Writers continue to have invisible friends. It's just they become more complex and turn into Madame Bovary rather than Casper the Friendly Ghost or Frank the monster who lives under your bed. I never really noticed it. It's just I just get unhappy if I don't spend time transferring what I imagine into text. And when I'm transferring it into text, this sets up a feedback loop. The process of transferring it into text creates a demand for more imaginative things to transfer. So this virtuous spiral gets set up. When I wrote bad poetry as a teenager, that turned into stories. We are word nerds. I love the difference between the word maybe and perhaps. They mean the same thing, but when I'm writing, I think about when to use maybe and when to use perhaps. I love this stuff. Like some people love baseball cards or different types of boats or bell ringing or stamp collecting. For me, it's, for all writers, it's words and their textures and nuances and the way they do fit together or don't, or fit together concordantly or discordantly. Or I love all this stuff. So yeah, I'm an unreformed word nerd. Probably always have been. And why? Who knows?
as a word nerd,
Mm.
you must have faced some pretty stiff challenges when you wrote the Seven Autumns of Jacob de Zoet.
Yeah, yeah, that was a nightmare because word nerdery is not enough. You have to make the word nerdery era appropriate, and not only, well, it was a nightmare. I had to translate everything I wrote. There's about 9 dialects in that book. There's Dutch people speaking, there's Japanese people speaking, there's British people speaking, there's working class Dutch, English, Japanese people speaking, there's educated, so people speaking the same languages, all in English, but I need to create the impression it's not English. In Japanese of the era, men would speak somewhat differently to women, so I had to try to represent that as well. I had to work out, and then even in Dutch there are different regions of the country, of course. So Northerners speak differently to Amsterdammers. It was horrendous, but it is a literary crime if all of your writers speak the same way. That pricks the bubble of plausibility of fiction. There's enough characters in there anyway. Sort of, I have to distinguish them by using language, and build character with dialogue, as writers always need to. So yes, that was a very, very stiff challenge. And from that point of view, it's the hardest thing that I've ever written. So I had to translate everything into its appropriate sub dialect. I started off combing 18th century novels for language that people used but which we don't use now. And there's lots there, journals, diaries, novels. And first early manuscript of Jacob de Zoet, I used it. I had people speaking it, but immediately hit 2 problems. One, what language are they thinking in? Because it's somehow mad if they're thinking in 18th century language. It's not mad, but it makes it a very dense, impenetrable text if there's no rest for a 21st century eyeball. If the whole thing is an 18th century language, it's really hard work. And then the more accurate I became, the more like pastiche it appeared. It sounds basically like Blackadder, even though it was accurate. So I had to dismantle it and write in a dialect which feels and smells right and sounds right, but which actually wasn't right. But it's the right, wrong dialect. It's the right, wrong form. There's a lot of that in novels. You have to search for the right wrongness, because sometimes the rightness doesn't work. If the novel were a company, then its mission statement would need to be, this has to work as a novel. And sometimes authenticity will impede that mission statement. And sometimes inauthenticity will enhance it. It's like if you're writing a novel about a life. If you do it accurately in real time, you would need to include the long, turgid, monotonous sections where not much happens. The same for war. Sort of, you need to edit it so that it's got a coherent form. If you don't, then you've got a dead novel. No one buys it. I can't feed my children. It's disastrous. I wouldn't be here. Creation myths aren't real, and if they sound too neat, then they're partly manufactured. No one knows what the imagination is, and the words inspiration and creativity are handy, but what on earth are they? Inspiration is just having a good idea. Creativity is an inclination towards making something. So instead I'll give you 3 factors which fed into why I'm here as a writer. Oh, lovely dog. These are my stammer, my speech impediment, which made it very hard for me to express myself externally, verbally. Yet I'm a word nerd. So what was the only outlet that was not politically dangerous for a 13-year-old kid at a state comprehensive school? While the outlet was writing. There I could feed my word nerdery. That's number 1. 2, yeah, just the gratification I got back when it's profoundly fulfilling to write a sentence where there's nothing wrong with it. It's just well crafted and, you know, English subject, verb, object. Let's see if we can make the object passive, put that at the front, and then put in a phrase, have a cliche here, but then just explode the cliche from inside and end with a comma and an adverb, full stop. Oh, look at that! It's got a rightness about it. That's really fulfilling. That's one of the best feelings ever. Get a few of those and you've got a nearly perfect paragraph. It's never perfect, but nearly perfect is good enough. So just a gratification, that's why I'm here. And the third is genetics. It's built this way. Don't know why. Thanks Mum, thanks Dad, thanks Universe, thanks Tea, thanks Stone, thank you, good night. Thank you. And thank you, Kim. Is that a wrap?